Right, yeah, I'm David Clarke, and my interest in UFOs goes back to being a schoolboy. I think from about the age of 11, when I went to see Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I think it must have been 1977 or 78. And from that moment onwards, I have not been able to escape the grip of this subject in one form or another. I used to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast when I started out, and I've grown increasingly sceptical and cynical since as I've got older. Well, there's quite often been said that, that ufology needs to be taken seriously by science, but I don't really think that is the main reason for ufology. I mean, do we need to be taken seriously by science? That's my question. Why do people feel that they need to be taken seriously by scientists? I mean, surely if the subject satisfies what people are looking for, as it does, in a lot of respects, why would having scientists take it seriously make any difference? That's the way I sort of look at that question. And I think there's absolutely no chance, given the way that the image that ufology has got in the media. It's entertainment rather than information, the way that the media presents this subject. You only have to look at some of the stuff that's on the cable TV channels and the way that the Sun and the tabloids portray the subject. No scientist in his or her right mind would go within 100 miles of ufology. And besides, the thing is with ufology that there isn't just one thing. You might get scientists interested in aspects of ufology, such as they might look at why people are fascinated by the subject, in which case you get psychologists interested in it. You might get atmospheric physicists who will look at things like earth lights, plasmas, that kind of thing. You might get meteorologists take an interest in it. Historians might be interested in how the subject came about and how it's evolved. But you're not going to get scientists per se looking at UFOs. You might get individuals who will look at the areas in which they're particularly fascinated, but I just think you're on a hiding to nothing expecting scientists to take an interest in the subject. Yeah, well, I know people don't like to talk about UFOs as modern folklore, but the fact is you can't escape from the fact that that's what it is. I mean, go back 100 years, people weren't talking about flying saucers. People who the same kind of people who you find in ufology and related subjects today would have been spiritualists at the turn of the last century. There would have been the people with, table turning and spirit rapping and this kind of thing, who were searching for the same kind of answers, like, is there somebody out there? I mean, some of the spiritualists claim that they're in contact with people on Mars and other planets and things, so there is a lot of overlap between the two. And if you look at the early 1950s, I mean, people in the noughties, and certainly in the 90s and the 80s, didn't really sort of know the history of their own subject. When I was writing the Flying Sorcerers book, we were concentrating on that early period in the history of the subject. The 50s and the 60s, a fascinating time which few people who are interested in the subject now know much about. But if you go back to then and you look at what people were interested in, the subjects that were fascinating them, the contactees, the fact that people were going around saying, oh yeah, the answer's just round the corner, we just force the government to admit that flying saucers exist and we can all go home and be happy. Exactly the same things were being said in the 1950s that are being said now, 60 years later. So the subject's just reinventing itself. There are lots of different side branches like crop circles and this, that and the other. But it's an evolving folklore. And at the end of the day, people don't really understand what folklore is, and they don't understand what myth is. And when I use the words myth and folklore, people think I'm being dismissive or disrespectful to people who have UFO experiences. People have UFO experiences, there's no doubt about it. When I'm talking about folklore and I'm talking about myth, I'm talking about the wider sort of aspects of it and the people who become involved and what they believe. And the fact is, folklore is just people's stories passed down through the generations. And the fact is, 99.999% of the UFO literature is just stories that people have told. There may be evidence that people have seen things, yeah, but at the end of the day, there's no physical evidence of anything. It is just people's stories, therefore it's folklore. In another 100 years' time, in the way that we're looking back now at spiritualism at the end of the 19th century, someone, I know it's difficult to conceive it, here in 2009, in another 100 years' time, we'll be standing in this field, or our descendants will be thinking about all those bizarre things that people used to believe in the 1990s, you know, flying saucers and crop circles, and the subject will have moved on to something completely different by then. It'll still be the same subject, but it'll have evolved into something else. Yes, well, the classic, I've had to write about this actually for this book that I'm doing for the National Archives, because they wanted a section on crop circles, because there's some papers, I mean, if you've been through the latest files that have been released, you know, in the 1980s, the guy on the UFO desk, who I think was Owen Hartop at the time, the one prior to Nick Pope, he had to begin to start answering questions from crop circle enthusiasts at the same time as ufologists. So there's a lot of, well, there's a bit of MOD involvement in the 80s and 90s, so I had to do some research on this. And in terms of how long they've been around, they've obviously been around in some form for a long, long time. And I know that in some of Arthur Shuttlewood's books, there's mention of some very basic crop circles turning up around Cradle Hill in the late 1960s. And also, I think Ralph Noyes, who was interested in crop circles, he's another MOD guy. I think he found some accounts from farmers from the 1940s of marks in fields. And the classic example is the woodcut from 1678, the mowing devil, which is not, if you look at it, it's not actually a crop circle, because the actual crops will actually cut, if you look at the illustration with a scythe. But I mean, that could be just an interpretation. But with all those things from the 17th century, you can't take them at face value. To actually take that mowing devil story as an example of a crop circle, it's a bit like Eric von Daniken used to do with some of the evidence he used for ancient astronauts. It's like what we're seeing now and reinterpreting, it's in the eye of the beholder. And that because we're looking at it from the late 19th century, when we've all grown up in a culture that's saturated by science fiction and visitors from outer space and that, we're interpreting things in that way, when the people who might have originally produced these drawings or illustrations might have seen things in a completely different way. And they obviously did, because they thought weird things like circles appearing in crops overnight were the work of the devil, or the fairies or demons. And again, we go back to folklore, because people nowadays are saying, oh, well, it's obvious that we've been visited by aliens, and that all these stories about fairies and spirits and things that people believed in the past, obviously they were seeing aliens as well, but they weren't as clever and intelligent as what we are. But you could look at it the other way around. It could be us that aren't intelligent, and that actually these things are being created by little folk and devils and fairies and things, you know, and we're just seeing them as aliens, because, you know, we live in the space age. Oh, wow. Well, I don't think it's not accurate to say that I'm the man behind the release of these files, because it's been quite a team effort to get these files released, and I've got to sort of pay tribute to the work that Joe McGonigal, Gary Anthony, Andy Roberts and various other people have done in order to get these files released. But what I'd point out for starters is that even before the Freedom of Information Act came along in 2001, we had what was a precursor to that, which was called, long-winded title, the Code of Practice for Access to Government Information, which John Major brought in 1994. And basically that allowed you to apply to see government documents that would normally have been withheld for 30 years. And bizarrely enough, even though that was brought in 1994, as far as I'm aware, no one in ufology actually used it to ask to see some of these MOD files, such as the Rendlesham incident. And I'd been interested in ufology during the 80s, early 90s, and I sort of became disenchanted with it and dropped out of the subject during the mid-1990s. Became interested again during the sort of period when the X-Files was popular, and it was the same old rubbish really that had been going on in the 1980s. So I thought, how can I approach this? How can I do something differently? And I was interested at the time in the big 1967 UFO wave, and I was working on a project with Jenny Randalls, Paul Fuller, Andy Roberts, various other people, to actually do sort of like a catalogue of the sightings during 1967. And we became aware that the MOD files for that year were about to be released at Kew. So we set up this big expedition where I think it was 3 of us went down for a week. And if you've ever been to the National Archives, it was called the Public Records Office then, by the way. When you first go there, it really is difficult to get your head around how you order these files, how you find where they are. Even just searching for them is difficult. So we spent this entire week really just tapping words into the search engine, and we managed to see, I think, 2 or 3 files. But it dawned on me then that this was a fantastic resource, and that in future there was going to be more and more of these files released, because I don't know whether you're aware, but before the mid-1960s most of the early files had been destroyed. So there's only files from around 1965 to 67 that exist. So with the 30-year rule, they were being released. And when I looked through these things, I thought, what a fantastic resource. And other countries have got really good UFO archives. There's a fantastic archive in Sweden, there's a fantastic archive in Italy, both of which I've visited. There's nothing like that here. Very few private individuals have actually kept papers from that far back, correspondence, sighting reports. Only the MOD have done it, bizarrely enough. Well, the ones that have survived anyway. So ever since that point, I just became more and more interested in the contents of these official files. I mean, lots of people think it's utter rubbish, it's all a whitewash, this, that and the other, the secret files are being held anywhere. Forget that nonsense for the moment. The files that are released, I've got some very interesting content. So I continue to go. Every 1st of January I was down there, the new set of files that were released, a bit like going backwards in time, going down memory lane. I worked all my way through the 1970s, and then of course we got to 2005 with the Freedom of Information Act. And I thought, well, now is the chance to sort of pile the pressure on. Being a journalist, I use the FOI all the time to source stories, so I just thought now is the time to set up a campaign, bombard the MOD with requests, and what I did first of all is get a list of the files. There's lots of people who write in making FOI requests, and you can see this on their log when you look at it. It's like, send me everything you've got on aliens, or what do you know about this case, or what do you know about that case? If you're making a good Freedom of Information Act request, you've got to do your homework. You've got to know exactly what you're asking for, you've got to know exactly who you're asking, and you've got to have some kind of background information. So I got a long list of all the files that had survived, that were slowly moving down the system to be released after 30 years. And I just cherry-picked. I just picked a file that I thought looked interesting, and I just made an application and said, please, could I have this file, or could I have that file? And I could see the consternation. I could hear the consternation from the MOD people who were responding to this, because it was like, oh my God, it's him again. You know, what can we allow him to have this time? And slowly and surely, over a period of about 3 or 4 years, and I was doing this with 4 or 5 other people who were all making similar requests, and I was saying, I'll ask for this file, you ask for that file, and they cottoned on to the fact that we were all working as one group. And there's a regulation of the FOI that if they can figure out that you're working with someone else to obtain more information than what you're allowed, I think it's so many 100 pages at a time, they can block the requests. So they tried doing that, but because we knew how to work the system, we could then appeal, take it to the Information Commissioner, and we got most of what we wanted. So this campaign built up. First success was obviously getting the Rendlesham Forest file in 2001, before Georgina Bruni, whatever she may have said at the time. Flying Saucer Working Party followed shortly after that, and that really was quite a scoop, because the file had been destroyed, so we were told. They didn't have the file, it had been lost years ago, and it was only through persistence and real hard work, detective work, that we managed to find the final surviving copy, which was released. Then of course hundreds and hundreds of pages followed that, and really the pinnacle of it all was discovering the existence of this Defence Intelligence Staff study, the Condign report, which was a real scoop. We got that released, and I think really it was the momentum that built up. It wasn't just us, there was lots of other people making applications as well. And I think, well, I know that eventually they said, it's costing us a huge amount of money to respond to all these individuals, and I know that they had someone over from America, from the Defence Department, who said, look, we've had a Freedom of Information Act from the 1960s, this subject won't go away. You know, 40 years have passed and we're still getting loads and loads of applications for UFO information. So I think, well, during September 2007 they had a meeting at the MOD. I think they had to get approval from the Secretary of State at the time. Can't remember his name, who it was, they changed so rapidly. But they said, look, in the long term, it's going to be costly to release all this stuff, but it's going to be a lot less costly than responding to all these individual applications. So wisely, I think, they decided to put all this stuff out, because they knew that there's all these conspiracy theories and there's all these things about this has been hidden, that's been hidden. And wisely, and a very good move I thought it was, they decided, whatever people believe about this subject or don't believe, let's just put all this stuff out there. There's nothing sensitive in this material, and we've all seen it now, those that have been on the website. You can look for yourself. you can draw your own conclusions, and I think it's a fantastic example of open government. And I was amazed that they actually decided to do this, because I thought they would just hang on and be as uncooperative as possible and only release what they absolutely had to release, because that's the impression I got for the first 4 years of this campaign. But it was a fantastic success, and I'm proud of it. Yeah, at Sheffield University is, or was, the only university in the country where you could do a PhD in folklore. Lots of universities in America do similar things, and it's quite strong in Europe as well, but it's all wrapped up with this thing about English identity and English folklore. You know, that's sort of like, you know, we've got the Scots devolution now, and the Scots are very sort of into their folklore and their beliefs and traditions, and the Welsh are and the Irish are, but the English aren't. We're almost sort of embarrassed at our heritage, you know, and you know, things like Morris dancing and mocks, and you know, the sort of like embarrassment about what is English, what does it mean to be English, and that centre was set up at Sheffield University in 1966 by Professor John Widdowson, who was he was actually, his qualification was English literature and linguistics, but he was interested in folklore, and he gathered lots of traditions and beliefs and things in the Peak District. And because he was a big cheese at Sheffield University at the time, they said, oh, what, you have your own little centre for folklore studies. And he spent literally 30 years of his life just collecting people's beliefs and traditions, and these were all archived at Sheffield. And there was a library, there was a fantastic archive, and there was a teaching section which was part of the School of English. And that's, it wasn't where I did my degree. I did my degree in archaeology at Sheffield University, and I became interested in folklore rather than the scientific side of it. So I went on to do my PhD at Sheffield University. At the same time as working full-time as a journalist, which was quite a feat. But I managed to finish the bloody thing off after about 6 years. And that's how I ended up teaching the subject there, because there was a massive demand from students who had taken, say, a degree in English or history, and they heard that there was this folklore department that offered modules on, you know, supernatural belief, English folk traditions, that kind of thing. So for a really good period of about 5 years, I made sort of a side sort of thing, lecturing there and running courses for undergraduate students. This is not like an evening course or anything like this. This is part of a degree that they would eventually get in, say, English language or English literature, and they would have a folklore part of it. And all the courses were oversubscribed, but again, all good things don't last, and the university had other priorities, so that course still runs, but it doesn't have the teaching element anymore, and the archive now has been amalgamated into the main university collection. So if you're interested in folklore, you can still go and visit the folklore archive at Sheffield, but it isn't what it used to be, put it that way. And I was offered a better job at Sheffield Hallam University, which is the old Poly, teaching journalism, which I'm now doing full time. So my connection with the old folklore department is well, really, I'm just sort of like a fellow now there. But if you go on the website, it does appear as if it still exists, and I still get students emailing me saying, Can I come to your supernatural belief module? Can I subscribe to that and enrol to it? And I just say, sorry, it's not run since 2005. Yeah, the supernatural in warfare is another subject that I've been interested in, and partly as a result of the work I've done at the National Archives. And I published a book in, when was it? 2004, a book on the Angel of Mons, and I became very obsessed with that story, because again, the folklore side of my interest came into that. In that I'd read lots and lots about the Angel of Mons, this story from the First World War. For those who don't know, it was an inspiring tale that was spread in 1914 about how, when the British Army had the first sort of encounter with the overwhelming German forces in August 1914 in Belgium, that they were rescued by this vision that appeared in the sky of, well, initially it was supposed to be celestial archers led by St. George, and then it transformed into angels who sort of produced this sort of invisible barrier that allowed the British Army to escape. Now, it all seems ludicrous now, but people believed it in 1914. And again, I go back to this thing about, you know, things that we believe and what people may think in another 100 years' time. But I looked into that in great detail, and lots of other people have done as well, to try and find who it was who originated this story. And despite hoping that I would find some evidence that it was independent of fiction, it does seem as if it was that Arthur Machen, the Welsh writer of supernatural fiction, who'd written this story that was published in one of the London newspapers about a month after the battle, which was totally invented, that was based, seemingly, some people thought, upon a real story about St George and the bowmen from Agincourt coming to rescue the British soldiers. And this was published, and because of the time nobody really knew what had gone on in Belgium at the time, because there was no internet, there was no radio. People relied upon gossip, rumour and things that were published in newspapers, which is no different really, for their information. So thousands and thousands of people across the world believe this story, and you know, it's sort of grown into a huge sort of legend. So I ended up writing a full book on the subject, and this got me looking at previous examples of the supernatural in warfare and more recent ones. I mean, obviously there's the Foo Fighter experiences that people had, and also there were similar experiences that soldiers have reported in other conflicts in the Second World War, not on the same scale of the Angel of Mons, but there's lots and lots of stories that soldiers tell, if you can get them to talk, that is, about things that have happened to them right in the middle of battles, you know, sort of where their colleagues have been killed and they were expecting instant death, and suddenly someone appeared on the battlefield and said, come this way, follow me, and they've escaped just in the nick of time. And also you got people right up to the Iraq War, people, you know, some of these pilots flying Apache helicopters in Iraq, who, despite being sort of you know, living in the 21st century and sort of you know, sort of flying the most technically advanced aircraft in the world, they've set out with things sewn into their uniforms, you know, good luck charms and protective talismans and things like that. So although they're fighting a modern war, they're harping back to sort of a medieval period, you know, calling upon the saints to protect them, little talisman, rabbit's feet round the neck, that kind of thing. So it suggests that despite the fact that they were modern and sophisticated, we still harp back to old superstitions when we're you know, in situations that we can't control. So that's what interests me as a folklorist. I would agree that Foo Fighters defy explanation, actually, and that's certainly the conclusion the various authorities at the time came to. It was interesting, again, as part of this research that I've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years at the National Archives. I was quite intrigued to do some work on the Foo Fighters, because there'd been lots and lots of speculation about had the RAF or the Air Ministry or the Americans ever done an inquiry into the subject, and people had made attempts to try and find some evidence of this in the past and got nowhere. And the reason was, I go back again to this thing about when you first go to the National Archives at Kew, and you have to get your head around how you actually find these documents. The fact is, you've got to use the right terminology when you're searching. So in the past, people have been writing to the Royal Air Force and saying, do you have any files on Foo Fighters? And of course the answer came back, no, because the RAF didn't interpret them as Foo Fighters. They didn't use that word. And when you interview, as Andy Roberts did in the 80s, some of the surviving witnesses, some of the gunners on Lancasters and that who'd seen these things, and Andy said, have you ever heard of Foo Fighters? They said, what? We didn't call them that, what are you talking about? And so when he described these strange balls of light, they said, oh yes, we used to see them things, we used to call them the Thing, which is interesting, the link with Warminster. The Thing, or the Light, or balls of fire, that kind of thing. So when I then immediately went to look at the National Archives material, and I typed in all these various keywords, I typed in balls of fire, phenomena, bang, 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 the files were there. Nobody had seen them. They'd been sitting there for 20 years and no one had looked at them. So straight away, I mean, they don't really tell you much, but they certainly show that there were lots and lots of reports from aircrew, and that the Air Ministry at the time were absolutely baffled by these things. They did a couple of like studies of the subject, nothing like the Condine report, but they were fighting a war. They didn't have any resources to sort of look at these things in a scientific way. All they were interested in, and this is a theme that goes right through to present, is were these things secret weapons, not from aliens, but from the Germans or the Japanese? And as soon as they were able to say, well, they certainly exist, we don't know what they are, but we've no evidence that any of them have harmed any of our aircraft or any of our aircrew, so we'll just ignore them. They're just something bizarre, you know, we'll file it away, which is the MOD's attitude seemingly right up to the present day. All they're interested in is, as they say, defence significance, you know, and to them, they can't quantify creatures from Mars. You know, it's not something they can get a handle on. what they can get a handle on, certainly during the Second World War, you know, German secret weapons, guided rockets, the Me-262 jet fighter that the Germans were flying at the time, those kinds of things. That's what they wanted to know about. And as soon as they'd eliminated them, what these Foo Fighters were, or whatever they were called, were of no interest to them. So they did do studies, and just in the last year or so, working with a guy whose name I forgot, who wrote the Foo Fighter book called Strange Company, Keith Chester, he's found some interesting correspondence which doesn't seem to have survived in the British archives, where the British Air Ministry and it was called SHAEF at the time, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, they did a study in which R.V. Jones was involved, and Bob Robertson, who's a big cheese in the CIA study of UFOs in 1953. And they looked at the subject in 1945, just as the war was coming to a close, and they couldn't explain what these things were. They were definitely a mystery. And people seem to think that because the government investigates things, that they must know everything, but it seems to me that they're just as baffled as the ordinary person in the street. So yeah, there were Foo Fighter studies, and all they could say was that this was some baffling kind of new natural phenomena that they couldn't explain, but they did think that certainly R.V. Jones, some of his papers, he's left a reference at the Churchill archives about Foo Fighters that says something on the lines that 95% of them they could explain as natural phenomena, 5% they couldn't, which is very similar to UFOs, and that they thought that possibly some of these crews, because they were so hyped up and they were expecting to see things, that they did see things, but what they were seeing were actually real German rockets, maybe even sort of bright stars and planets and things like that, and open fire on them. And that might seem ludicrous. You might think, oh, these pilots, they know what they're doing, they couldn't possibly mistake what they're seeing, but we know that people do make mistakes. And there's some good examples from the First World War, which is in my new book, by the way, available at all good bookshops, that I've dug out. In the First World War, 1914, people were terrified by German Zeppelins. They'd seen these huge inflatable things full of hydrogen that exploded on contact with. But at the time, 1914, that was the new secret weapon. The Germans had perfected these things. We had nothing that could go anywhere near them at the time, and people assumed, as soon as the war broke out in August 1914, that the Zeppelins would be over England dropping bombs on London. In fact, we now know that they didn't work properly. They were very prone to blowing up and crashing and this kind of thing. And the first air raid didn't take place until I think it was early 1915. And yet, if you go to the National Archives, there are bulging files full of reports from military officers, police officers who'd seen Zeppelins all over the country. And in fact, there's one classic case at Vickers Yard, a shipyard in Cumbria, which is one of the most sensitive military areas in the north of England. A few days after the war broke out in August, there's a whole host of soldiers there who'd seen 3 airships, cigar-shaped objects, they called them Zeppelins, but UFOs for all intents and purposes, over the Vickers shipyard, and they opened fire on this thing with machine guns. And there's report after report after report in the files to the War Office in London, and MI5, who were also involved in this, saying, you know, there was definitely 3 airships over Vickers last night. We opened fire on it, we didn't cause any damage. And you find also in these files, there's other reports from some of the commanding officers saying, the men called me out and they were firing at this thing in the sky, but I looked up and all I could see was a star with a cloud going over it. So is that the same thing that people were seeing that they were calling Foo Fighters in the Second World War? Maybe. But that doesn't mean to say that they were all explainable in that way, and I still think that there are quite a few instances of things that are inexplicable, and the best one I found in the Foo Fighter records is the Lancaster from, I think it was 42 Squadron, that were on a raid over Turin in northern Italy in 1942, and they saw this, not just a light, but a very large object with all these red lights arranged around it that was sort of flying around randomly. They saw it 2 or 3 times, they saw it flying up a valley in the Alps, didn't seem to cause them any damage, but more than just a light, this is a structured object with strange formations of lights on it, nothing like what was flying at the time. And bizarre report, it went right to the headquarters of the Bomber Command. They took it seriously. They were ridiculed when they got back by the other members of the crew, and yet they stuck to the story, which suggests to me that they did see something unusual. So, yes, we can explain them all, but not all of them. Explain them all, but not all of them. Some of them, but not all of them. Well, the book came about basically as a result of the massive interest that's been shown in these released files at the National Archives, and because of the fact that I was a well-known face down there, I was constantly down there asking for the most recent files, and because of the fact that I've worked in PR and as a journalist, it was a natural choice of the National Archives staff. Here's a guy who's got some academic background who can put these files in context. They didn't just want to just release them with no background contact, with no historical sort of background. So it was, will you work for us? So I suppose, as people have been accusing me for years, I am now working for the government. Fair enough. It was, will you come down, produce a background research guide? You know, every time we do a release, will you go through the files and at least provide some sort of like highlights, so that people who know nothing about the subject, who are logging on in New Zealand or Hawaii or wherever, they see hundreds and hundreds of pages, and if you're one of these people that's gone on there and you've just been overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that is in these files, hundreds and hundreds of pages, it's handy, isn't it, if you've got sort of like, go to page such and such, and you'll see this report on the Cosford incident or on the Rendlesham case or something like that. So that's basically what I was contracted to do, and also to sort of advise them on the PR side of this, because basically they don't have any experts on UFOs. You know, so it's like, we need to find an expert, and the National Archives, when they do stuff on like First World War soldiers' records, they have to go and find someone, usually somebody who works for a university, who will sort of front the release, who will speak to newspapers and TV and that, which is what I've done. Now, I don't think they quite realised what they were getting themselves in for when they agreed to host all these files that the MOD were wanting to transfer. And if you go to the National Archives, you'll realise that all they're really interested in, or all they have been interested in primarily in the past, is family history, people going to do genealogy and, you know, research their ancestors, that kind of thing, and military history. You know, my granddad was in the First World War. They couldn't quite get their head around UFOs, and you know, they knew that some people thought there was a load of nonsense, and I was arguing, no, it's not nonsense, it's a serious subject, it's social history, you should be promoting it in the same way that you promote all the other things you do, and I've won that battle, and I think that's quite an important battle to win, really. It's got the subject respectability, and I was really pleased that not so much the first batch of files that were released, but the second one in October, the newspaper coverage of that, I thought, was very, very serious. It wasn't really taking the piss anymore. It was like, there's some interesting things here. You know, the guy that tried to shoot down the UFO over East Anglia and that, he was treated in a serious way. And I don't want to bang my drum too much, but that was mainly as a result of me fronting the release of those files and saying to journalists, forget Algar the alien, look at this is an interesting case, this really happened, it was taken seriously by the military. So I've had some success there. Whether it will continue for the rest of the releases, because there's another 100 files to come yet. You're talking tens of thousands of pages there that have got to be sorted through and presented in the right kind of way. But it suddenly dawned on them, certainly with the first release, there was something like 1.7 million unique visitors to the website in the first couple of weeks, which is absolutely, it stunned them. It was double the amount of people who logged on to look at the Doomsday Survey online, which was about 6 months before. They'd never seen anything like it. So obviously they thought, oh, we ought to have a book. So that's how the book came about. So I've been writing the book ever since, in between trying to promote these files and teach students and mark essays and all this kind of thing. So the book really will be a survey of the highlights from the files, and basically I start off by looking at some of the 19th century cases that are in the archives. There's a few interesting stories about lights in the sky before there were UFOs, and there's a full chapter on UFOs in warfare. So I look at the First World War phantom airship scares, lots and lots of documents in there, including the investigation that Churchill was involved in 1912 when there was a UFO seen over Sheerness Dockyard in Essex. Lots and lots of cases from the First and Second World War, and I bring it right up to present, up to 2000, with the release of the files and the Condign report. And what I've been able to do, because I'm writing it for the National Archives and it's been published by the Her Majesty's Stationery Office, I've been able to use all their material without having to ask permission, which has been absolutely fantastic. You know, it's like allowing Dracula access to a blood bank. You know, so I've been able to just pick and choose whatever I want, all those fantastic documents, you know, the Churchill memo and what have you, and rather than having to sort of go and beg permission to use it and pay huge amounts of money, it's just sort of like, yes, I'll have that document, this document, the other. So hopefully, when it's finally published, I think in August, what you'll get to see is a really interesting selection of all the key documents from the archives, right from 1912 right up to the present day. It won't provide any answer to the mystery, but I can guarantee there'll be lots and lots of really bizarre cases that are in those Ministry of Defence files that most people who buy the book won't have any, even hardcore UFO fans won't have any idea about. Because what you've got to understand is the files that are going on the internet are just mainly the files from 1980 to present. And I think a lot of people seem to be confused about this, that there is a whole host of files that are just there in paper form at the National Archives, right back from the First World War, right up to 1980. And you've actually physically got to go to Kew to see those. The ones that you can download are really only the more recent files. So what I've tried to do is pick the most interesting documents and the most interesting accounts from like almost 100 years of hundreds of thousands of pages of documents and material. What's next for me? Retirement, I think. We should probably, loads of people listening to this now will be clapping at that prospect. No, I shall never escape from the grip of ufology, because I've been interested since I was about the age of 11, so I think, you know, if I last that long, in my dotage I'll still be fascinated by the subject. I don't know where I go next. I think even after all these files have been released, there's still a lot of work to be done on them, and I've got various sort of irons in the fire in terms of trying to persuade the reluctant world of academia to take the subject seriously, and to provide some funding into doing a proper study. You know, the Condign study, for instance, tried to set up a database. I think they inputted something like 10 or 15 years of material from the MOD files, but they did it in such a cack-handed way that the conclusions are totally flawed and useless. But what I'd like to do is get a proper research assistant to sit down and produce a proper database that inputted all the right information and tried to sort of use that to question the data that's there about who sees UFOs, you know, at what times of year, are there any common denominators, you know, try and get under the skin of it, instead of asking, you know, are there people from outer space visiting us, or is it all nonsense, to sort of get under the skin of it and to ask them a little bit more nuanced questions about the material. So that's what I'm going to pursue, and I'm going to pursue my folklore interests. Not mainstream ufology, I'm afraid, because I think I've done everything that is possible to do, and until something comes along, you know, that takes us further, it's almost like being trapped in Groundhog Day, and that you're just doing the same things over and over again. And it really, really pisses me off when I log on and there's somebody banging on about the regiment that disappeared at Gallipoli, and you just think, that one has been killed off so many times. It's a bit like one of those fairground things, you know, where you've got the little things popping up and you have to hit it with the hammer and it comes up somewhere else. There's only so much you can do.